Amidst Chinese New Year celebrations on February 1st, 2022, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors approved a resolution issuing a formal apology to Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans for the recent anti-Asian hate. However, discrimination against Chinese people in America did not just start. The United States has a long-standing history of anti-Asian sentiments stemming all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s and early 1900s. As the influx of Chinese people coming to the U.S. fostered debates around immigration policies during the late 19th century, the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was intended to be a diplomatic response to the growing anti-Chinese sentiments, shifted the U.S.'s diplomatic and internal relations with the Chinese, influenced future debates on immigration, and cultivated the resurgence of modern-day anti-Asian biases.
In the late 19th century, America saw a major surge of Chinese immigrants who were driven by poor financial and social conditions back home. From 1839 to 1842, China was involved in the First Opium War fighting against Britain. When China ultimately lost the war, their economy took a heavy hit as a result of the reparations they were required to pay to Britain, and the increased British involvement caused by having to open up more ports to British trade resulted in social unrest among the Chinese people. Eager to escape the chaos in China and achieve economic mobility, many Chinese people considered America a land of opportunity, with the gold rush of 1848 and job opportunities being major motivating factors. From the moment Chinese immigrants arrived in California, they were met with hostility and racism from nativist groups. Initially, the U.S. government made several attempts to compromise between the demands of nativists while also trying to preserve peaceful diplomatic relations with China. For instance, the Angel Treaty was an agreement between the two countries that allowed the U.S. to limit but not fully ban Chinese immigrants. This was an attempt at diplomacy that ultimately failed when nativist outrage became too prominent for the U.S. to continue to placate. After much debate around the demands for stricter immigration policies, President Chester Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed by Congress in 1882 and effectively banned the immigration of Chinese laborers to the U.S. This act was directed primarily toward laborers because Chinese immigrants were more willing to take low-paying jobs than native-born Americans. The official piece of legislation states that the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good of certain localities. Although the original intent was to limit laborers, the Chinese Exclusion Act also worked to rid the U.S. of its existing Chinese population.
There were three major provisions in there. Number one, henceforth, when the law took effect, no more Chinese will be allowed to enter the country. And then number two, Chinese already in the United States will not be allowed to become naturalized citizens of the United States. I mean, in a so-called democracy, right? Everybody is supposed to participate in democratic decisions. And I mean, just think about the irony. In a democratic country, a single racial minority group was singled out for denial of citizenship and participation in democracy. Think about it.
This decision not only affected immigrants but also their children. In one specific case, Wong Kim Mark, born in the United States to Chinese immigrants, was denied re-entry to San Francisco after taking a trip to visit his family in China in 1897 on the grounds that he was not a citizen. Although the Supreme Court eventually ruled that this was in direct violation to the 14th Amendment, which states that those born in the United States are rightful citizens, even if they are born to non-citizens, this case further goes to show the extent to which the Chinese Exclusion Act affected not only those wanting to immigrate to the U.S., but also the Chinese people who were already legally living in the country.
These immediate effects of the act remained until the repeal of it in 1943. In the midst of World War II, the U.S. realized their most effective ally against the Japanese was China. They were afraid that the Japanese would use their exclusionary policies to disrupt any chance at an alliance with China, and as a result decided to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act in an attempt to mend their diplomatic relations with China.
Japan, of course, has invaded into China, and been broadcasting radio messages and dropping leaflets all over China to urge the Chinese, hey, why are you guys so stupid? You're fighting for America when look at these exclusion laws. And so Roosevelt and Congress got worried that it's undermining America's strategy to defeat Japan. So 1943, President Roosevelt sent a message to Congress that we have to repeal all the Chinese exclusion law to help America win the war against Japan.
America did not end the act because they realized how morally wrong it was, but because they feared losing a wartime ally. The policies and decisions that were enacted persisted well past the original terms of the Chinese Exclusion Act and fueled debate over foreign policies regarding other Asian immigrants during that time, as well as current immigration laws.
The Chinese exclusion law was not the only one that got enacted against Asian group. We enacted anti-Japanese exclusion law, again, thanks to San Francisco's agitation. And finally, the law got enacted in 1924.
In the early 1900s, California residents began to advocate for segregation in schools between Japanese students and white students so as to not contaminate the white children. Much like how the Angel Treaty was an initial attempt at diplomacy and served as a stepping stone to the Chinese Exclusion Act, Congress passed the Gentlemen's Agreement in 1907 as a compromise between nativist groups and the Japanese. This restricted, but didn't fully ban, unskilled Japanese laborers from receiving passports to immigrate to the U.S. in exchange for the desegregation of schools. Despite this diplomatic attempt, the passage of the Immigration Act in 1924 targeted other Asians, the Japanese in particular, from immigrating to the U.S.
Specific cases from when the Exclusion Act was active created long-term effects on how much power Congress and the executive branch has over immigration. In the Supreme Court case Che Chanping versus United States, the court ruled that it was unlawful for Che, who was a legal Chinese immigrant, to gain re-entry to the country after returning from a brief trip to China, despite him having been living in the U.S. prior to the passage of the act. When he returned to San Francisco, his certificate of re-entry was rejected on the account that the validity of it had been annulled by Congress. This ruling gave rise to the idea that foreign immigrants, even if legally admitted, are a military danger over which the federal government has total control, a concept that still proves to be relevant in more recent immigration debates, like the 2017 travel ban, which targeted nations with a Muslim majority. Similar to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the travel ban was aimed at foreigners based on their nationality, and the decisions surrounding the policies were made ultimately under the control of the federal government.
Over 100 years since the passage of this act, the effects of it are still obvious in the stereotypes assigned to those of Asian descent, as well as increased displays of anti-Asian sentiments. The myth of model minority, which stems from the relative economic success Asian immigrants achieved despite the discrimination they faced, continues to be a common ideology expected of Asian Americans. Although being labeled as a model minority seems like a positive title, it is loaded with hatred and jealousy. It expresses the idea that Chinese immigrants went through little to no difficulties in order to reach the level of success they are at right now. It essentially invalidates the suffering and difficulties that the Chinese immigrants had to endure in order to achieve a better future for their families. Many of these racially biased statements made towards Chinese immigrants are echoes of what was said in 1882.
During the last 2 years of the coronavirus pandemic, the United States witnessed a major rise in xenophobia and racism towards Asians. From verbally and physically assaulting to committing murder in broad daylight, these actions reflect the persistent ideas of the Yellow Peril, a negative image of Asians following their mass immigration during the latter half of the 19th century. The ideology of the Yellow Peril describes how nativists view Asians as dirty and a disease to American society, and serves as the foundation for the recent resurgence of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence. It was the failure of the U.S. government to find a diplomatic solution to the debate over Chinese immigration in the late 19th century that ultimately shifted the country's views on immigration, as well as the country's Asian culture and population.
So exclusion law is very, very pervasive in penetrating into every corner of our society and into our national consciousness.